There's a moment in music history when you can almost feel the floor shake beneath your feet, not because of the spotlight, but because of the people hidden just outside its glow. In the early 1970s, behind James Brown's explosive presence, a different kind of fire was burning. It came from a band whose rhythm could stop a crowd in its tracks, a group whose sound defined an era even when their names didn't. That band was the JB. They weren't just playing funk, they were shaping it, bending it, carving out grooves that would echo across generations. But how does a group so essential, so groundbreaking, slowly fade from the story they helped build? Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the JBs ever stepped into a studio, before their horns cut through the air with that sharp, unmistakable sound, and before the world connected their name to the very DNA of funk, there was uncertainty in the kingdom of soul. It was 1970, and James Brown, the man who seemed too powerful to ever face disruption, suddenly stood on stage without a band. Almost overnight, the musicians who had carried him through the height of his late 1960 career walked out, exhausted by the relentless schedule and Brown's famously demanding leadership. The world saw a superstar. The musicians saw a man who pushed them past every limit. That breaking point created the space where something new, unexpected, and historic was about to be born. In Cincinnati, a different story was unfolding. A young group called the Pacemakers had been sharpening their sound in small clubs, playing rhythm and blues with a raw edge. They were rooted in the working-class neighborhoods of Ohio, where music wasn't a dream so much as a lifeline. Among them were two brothers who carried electricity in their fingertips: Phelps, Catfish, Collins on guitar, and William Bootsy Collins on bass. They grew up in a world where you didn't wait for opportunity. You created your own groove and hoped the world caught up. That fearless attitude became the seed of what would eventually define the JBs. When word spread that James Brown had lost his band, those in his orbit knew he needed players immediately. Shows were booked, contracts were signed, audiences were expecting perfection. Brown reached toward Cincinnati, calling in the Pacemakers. Bootsy was only 18, Catfish barely older, and yet they arrived with a confidence born from playing night after night, learning how to hold a crowd with nothing but instinct and rhythm. To them, joining Brown wasn't just a job. It was a chance to step into the center of American music at a time when everything was changing. The early days were intense. Brown operated like a drill sergeant of sound. Miss a beat, and he would stop the entire band. Hit a wrong note, and he would glare at you as if you had broken a sacred rule. But the Pacemakers didn't run from the pressure. They leaned into it. They rehearsed until their fingers burned, until every break, every accent, every syncopation felt like second nature. By the time they walked onto the stage with Brown for the first time, they weren't just replacing his old band, they were reshaping what funk could be. As the months passed, more musicians joined, creating the earliest version of the JBs. There was Clayton "Chicken" Gunnels on Trumpet Street, Claire Pinckney on saxophone, and drummer John "Jabo" Starks, whose deep, steady pulse would become a heartbeat in the history of American rhythm. Each came from different cities, different families, and different musical traditions, but they shared one thing: an ability to lock into a groove so tight it felt like a single organism playing through dozens of hands. The world outside was also moving. It was the post-civil rights era, a time when black musicians were pushing the boundaries of American sound. Everything felt bold, raw, and unapologetically expressive. Funk wasn't just music, it was identity, it was defiance. It was freedom set to rhythm. The JBs were stepping into a cultural moment that demanded innovation, and they were young enough, hungry enough, and brave enough to deliver it. Their first major recording, The Grunt, didn't sound like anything the radio was used to. It was sharp, aggressive, and driven more by rhythm than traditional melody. Critics didn't know what to call it, but audiences felt it. That single captured the voice of a generation that wanted something new. The JBs weren't following trends. They were creating one. During this early period, James Brown gave the band something rare: space. While he remained the commanding force, he allowed these young musicians to explore ideas, experiment with structure, and push deeper into what would become the signature sound of funky minimalism. Bootsy's bass didn't just play notes, it talked. Catfish's guitar didn't simply keep time, it carved out the pocket. Jabo Starks didn't just hold the beat, he built the foundation for thousands of grooves that would be sampled decades later. Every night on the road felt like a test, but also like a revelation. They were discovering themselves as a band in front of live audiences who couldn't sit still once the first note hit. And somewhere in the chaos of late-night travel, endless rehearsals, and the fierce discipline of James Brown, the JBs found their identity. Before the fame, before the records, and long before their names were written into music history, they were simply a group of musicians chasing a sound the world hadn't yet heard. A sound that would soon become the backbone of funk itself. As the JBs settled into their new identity, something deeper began to take shape inside the band. What started as a rescue mission for James Brown was slowly turning into a creative movement with its own voice. The turning point arrived when Brown reached out to an old ally, a musician whose instincts, discipline, and arranging genius would become the glue that held everything together. His name was Fred Wesley. Wesley returned to Brown's orbit in late 1970, stepping back into the role of musical director. He came from a background shaped by jazz, gospel, and the disciplined structure of brass ensembles, and he brought with him a sense of order that the young band desperately needed. Where the Collins brothers brought raw fire, Wesley brought architecture. He could hear a groove and immediately know where each horn line should sit, where the bass should lean, and how the drums should punch through without overpowering the melody. Under his guidance, the JBs stopped sounding like a talented group of individuals and began sounding like a single, unified machine. The early recording sessions reflected this transformation. Songs no longer drifted on youthful improvisation, they snapped into place with precision. It was Fred Wesley who shaped the horn sections that would later define the band's identity. Trumpet players like Jerome Sainers and Russell Crimes, saxophonists like Jimmy Parker and Street Claire Pinkney, all found their place within Wesley's vision. And when they locked in, it was undeniable. The horn section could shout, whisper, and swing in the same breath, hitting accents so tight they felt like sparks flying from metal. During this time, the band produced two early standouts, Pass the Peas and Gimme Some More. These songs weren't just successful, they were statements. This was funk stripped down to its bones, built not from lush melodies but from repetition, space, and pulse. The JBs would play a single riff for minutes at a time, but the intensity never dropped. Instead, the groove deepened. It was music meant for the body as much as the mind, music that demanded movement. Audiences responded instantly. Night after night, people who had never heard the JB's name left concerts talking about the band more than the superstar they supported. There was something magnetic about the way they played. Even when James Brown wasn't at center stage, the energy never dipped. It was clear that something unusual was happening. A backing band was beginning to shine with the force of a headlining act. But success didn't come without challenges. Brown's strict leadership created tension, especially among the younger players who were still figuring out how to balance creativity with discipline. Bootsy Collins, brilliant but restless, often pushed rhythms and bass lines into experimental territory, testing the limits of Brown's tolerance. Catfish, more grounded, tried to hold the middle ground, helping the band stay focused. And through it all, Fred Wesley acted as the stabilizing presence, ensuring that the band stayed on course even when personalities clashed or the pressure mounted. This period marked the true beginning of the JB's voice. They weren't just playing funk anymore, they were defining it. They were discovering the power of tight interplay, the beauty of restraint, and the magic that happens when a rhythm section breathes in perfect unison. And though none of them knew it yet, they were on the verge of a breakthrough that would cement their place in music history. The breakthrough for the JBs didn't arrive quietly. It came in waves, carried by a sound so sharp, so urgent, that it made listeners stop whatever they were doing and lean in. That moment arrived in 1972, when the band released their first full-length album, Food for Thought. It wasn't simply another release under James Brown's orbit. It was a declaration, a statement that the JBs were no longer just the engine behind a superstar, but a creative force with something entirely their own to say. What set this period apart was the freedom the band began to explore inside the studio. The grooves stretched longer, the arrangements hit harder, and the confidence inside each musician became impossible to miss. When the record dropped, fans felt a new kind of intensity pulsing through the tracks. This wasn't background music. This was identity. This was funk unfiltered. Then everything changed when Maceo Parker returned. His re-entry into the group in early 1973 felt like the missing piece sliding perfectly back into place. His tone, his phrasing, the way he could slice through a groove with a single note, it elevated the entire band. The chemistry between Maceo, Fred Wesley, and the rhythm section was immediate, and together, they created the track that would send the JBs into the center of the funk universe, Doing It to Death. The song was a long, hypnotic jam with James Brown providing vocal calls. But make no mistake, this was the JBs at the wheel. The track shot to #1 on the R&B chart, and suddenly the world began to understand what musicians had been whispering about for years. The JBs weren't just a band, they were an institution, a sound, a movement. With that success came a shift in perception. Their name began appearing on posters, not just as a footnote under James Brown, but as performers in their own right. Crowds recognized them. DJs studied their rhythms. Younger musicians listened closely, trying to figure out how a band could be so disciplined yet so daring at the same time. This era marked the true turning point. The JBs had stepped out from behind the shadow of James Brown and into the spotlight of their own creation. They were no longer simply supporting a legend, they were building a legacy that would ripple across generations. And though their greatest triumphs were still ahead, this was the moment when the JBs became the JBs. By the time 1973 arrived, the JBs were no longer just a band finding their rhythm. They were the rhythm. Their sound had become the pulse of American funk, a living engine that powered dance floors, radio waves, and entire cultural shifts. What had started as a rescue operation for James Brown had evolved into one of the tightest, most influential ensembles in modern music. And now, they were entering the height of their reign. The release of Doing It to Death had thrust them into a new dimension of visibility. Suddenly, their grooves weren't only heard in live shows, they were dominating the airwaves. Musicians across the country dissected their recordings, trying to capture the secret behind their precision. But what the JBs had wasn't a formula. It was chemistry. It was instinct. It was the magic that happens when a group of musicians believes completely in the power of a single groove. As they stepped deeper into the mid-1970 period, their output only grew stronger. They followed their momentum with Soul Power 74, a track that delivered a sharper, more aggressive attitude. The horns cut through the beat like a blade. The bass line sat in the pocket with a confidence that dared you not to move. Everything felt bigger, bolder, yet still rooted in the simplicity that made funk so compelling. Their music didn't rely on complexity, it relied on conviction. Then came the album, Damn Right, I Am Somebody, a project that revealed just how far the JBs had come. Under Fred Wesley's leadership, the band crafted a record that was both musically fearless and culturally resonant. The title track carried an energy beyond entertainment. It spoke to identity, power, and pride at a time when Black artists were carving out space in American culture with unprecedented force. The album produced multiple R&B hits and cemented the band's reputation as more than a tool of James Brown. They had become storytellers, architects of a new musical language. Their live performances during these years were nothing short of legendary. Crowds didn't just listen, they surrendered. When the JBs opened a show, the air shifted. Every section of the band, from Bootsy's elastic bass to the razor-sharp horns, felt like its own universe. And yet, they moved as one. Even musicians from other genres, rock, jazz, soul, began attending their concerts just to witness the discipline, the stamina, the raw musicianship that defined their stage presence. Those who saw them often walked away stunned, questioning how a band could maintain such precision for hours on end. Behind the scenes, the band was experiencing a sense of pride that felt new to them. They were no longer anonymous players hidden behind the spotlight. They were artists shaping a movement. They were innovators setting the blueprint for generations to come. For the first time, major publications began writing about them directly, acknowledging their artistry, their vision, and their unmatched ability to control a groove. This was the JBs at their highest peak, unstoppable, undeniable, and fully realized. Their sound wasn't just popular, it was essential. And for a brief, shining period, they stood at the center of American funk, shaping the music of an era with every note they played. Even at the height of their success, when the JBs seemed untouchable, tiny fractures had already begun forming beneath the surface. The music was booming, the crowds were growing, and their influence was spreading across the country like wildfire. But behind the brilliant horn lines and the perfect rhythms, a quieter story was beginning to unfold, a story shaped by pressure, fatigue, and the shifting vision of the man who led them. James Brown, for all his genius, was also known for abrupt changes in direction. As he entered the mid-1970 period, his focus began drifting toward a more commercial path. He wanted tighter songs, simpler arrangements, and a sound that leaned toward mainstream dance rather than the raw, experimental funk the JBs had perfected. This shift created tension. The band, under Fred Wesley's leadership, had found its voice through long grooves, complex horn lines, and musical risk-taking. But Brown's new direction didn't leave much space for that kind of creativity. Members began feeling the strain. The long tours, the strict discipline, and the constant demand for perfection were taking their toll. Bootsy Collins, always a restless spirit, found himself pulled toward new possibilities. He loved the freedom of experimentation, and the changing atmosphere within Brown's camp made him question whether the JBs could continue growing. Others, like Jabo Starkson Street, Claire Pinkney, felt a different kind of pressure, the emotional weight of performing at such an intense level for so long without the recognition, compensation, or stability that their talent deserved. On the surface, the band was still unstoppable. They released Breaking Bread, a record filled with the same brilliance that defined their earlier work. But inside the studio, the energy had changed. The rehearsals felt heavier, the sessions felt tighter, and slowly, the joy that once fueled their sound began to dim. As the commercial success of James Brown's new material started to fade, the impact rippled directly into the band. The air of uncertainty grew thicker. The JBs were still producing quality music, but fewer people were listening. The rise of disco was reshaping dance floors, and the raw funk they championed seemed to be drifting out of mainstream favor. Whispers of departure began circulating among the musicians. Some talked openly about exploring new horizons. Others remained quiet but felt the same pull. The unity that once made them a single, unstoppable force was beginning to loosen. The seeds of decline were small at first, barely noticeable to the outside world. But inside the JBs, those seeds were already growing. And soon, they would bring an era to an unexpected and painful end. The fall of the JBs did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived quietly, like a slow dimming of the lights they had once commanded with such force. By the time 1974 turned into 1975, the pressure that had been building inside the band for years could no longer be pushed aside. The tours were endless, the rehearsals unforgiving, and the creative demands seemed to pull the musicians in contradictory directions. What had once been a powerful engine of unity was now trembling under the weight of exhaustion. The first major crack came from within. Fred Wesley, the architect of their sound, the man who shaped their horn lines and held the ensemble together through chaos, was growing restless. He had spent years balancing his own artistic vision with James Brown's mercurial leadership. Wesley admired Brown. He respected him. But the constant shifts in direction, the sudden decisions, and the increasing commercial pressure left him questioning his place in the band he had helped define. By mid-1975, Wesley made a choice that would change everything. He accepted an offer to join George Clinton's groundbreaking musical collective. It was an opportunity not just for better conditions, but for creative freedom. His departure hit the JBs like a shockwave. Without Wesley, the foundation of the horn section wavered. The internal communication that once kept the band so sharp began to unravel. And more importantly, the musicians lost the one figure who understood both their artistic needs and Brown's demanding expectations. With him gone, there was no buffer, no mediator, only the weight of a system that had been stretched too far for too long. But the unraveling had only begun. Bootsy Collins, whose electric bass lines had transformed the very definition of funk, had been wrestling with his own frustrations. The strict environment no longer matched his desire to explore, to experiment, to push boundaries that Brown's confines wouldn't allow. Soon after Wesley's exit, Bootsy stepped away as well. His brother Catfish followed him. Their departure stripped the JBs of the youthful spark that had powered many of their greatest moments. One by one, more musicians followed. Jabo Starks, the drummer whose heartbeat defined their groove, left for a more stable opportunity with B.B. King. Guitarist Cheese Martin stepped away. Saxophonist Jimmy Parker moved on. Even bassist Fred Thomas, one of the most reliable forces in the lineup, eventually departed. What had once been a unified collective was dissolving piece by piece. Inside studios and rehearsal rooms, the atmosphere became heavy with resignation. The chemistry that once energized them had evaporated. The band could still play, and play well, but the soul behind the sound had begun to fade. They were no longer creating history. They were surviving it. And through all of this, James Brown watched the group he had assembled slip through his fingers. His vision had changed. Their needs had changed. The world around them had changed. The once unstoppable force of the JBZs was now caught in a downward spiral they could no longer escape. The crisis was not a single moment. It was a long, painful unraveling, a silent recognition that the era they built together was coming to an end. When the departures began stacking one after another, the consequences reached far beyond the rehearsal rooms. The JBs had always been defined by unity, by the way, dozens of moving parts locked together into one sharp, unbreakable groove. But once the core members began to slip away, the heart of the band started beating out of sync. What remained was a shadow of the force that once reshaped the meaning of funk. James Brown tried to keep the group going. He replaced musicians, rotated sections, and pushed the remaining players harder than ever. But no combination could recreate the original chemistry. Bootsy's fearless bass lines, Wesley's architectural horn arrangements, Stark's soulful pulse, Catfish's rhythmic edge, these were not pieces you could simply swap out. They were ingredients of a sound that had been built through sweat, trust, and the rare kind of creative alignment that only happens once. Morale began to crumble. The glamour of touring faded, replaced by uncertainty and fatigue. The musicians who stayed behind felt the weight of carrying a legacy that was slipping out of their grasp. They were still talented, still capable, but something essential had been lost, the spark that drove their greatest years. Even the sessions that should have felt triumphant instead carried an air of finality. When they recorded Hustle with Speed in 1975, the music sounded polished, but the soul felt distant, as if the band was playing through the echo of its former self. Outside the studio, the world was changing too. Funk was no longer the only sound dominating American dance floors. Disco was rising fast, and with it came a new demand for slicker, more commercial production. The raw, earthy grooves that once shook the world suddenly felt out of place in an industry chasing a different kind of rhythm. The timing couldn't have been worse. As James Brown struggled to adapt, the JBs were dragged into a shift they never asked for. The next blow came when Polydor shut down Brown's People imprint, the label that had allowed the JBs to record independently. Without it, their side projects vanished overnight. The avenues they had used to express themselves were gone, and with no stable home for their music, there was little reason for the remaining members to stay. By 1976, only a handful of musicians remained. The shows continued, and Brown still toured with groups bearing the name the JBs, but the original spirit was gone. The original band had dissolved quietly, leaving behind a legacy built on rhythm, discipline, and a kind of musical brotherhood that could not be repaired once broken. For the musicians who had once defined the heartbeat of funk, the silence that followed was perhaps the hardest consequence of all. The world moved on. The spotlight dimmed. And the JBs, the band that once lifted James Brown to new heights, slipped into the shadows of history. When the original JBs faded from the stage, their absence left a silence the music world didn't immediately understand. But slowly, year by year, something remarkable began to happen. As new generations of artists searched for the roots of modern rhythm, they kept finding themselves tracing everything back to one band, the JBs. The group that had once stood behind James Brown now stood behind the evolution of American music itself. Long before the term became common, the JBs had defined what the world would come to know as groove. Their sound was stripped down but never empty, repetitive but never dull. It was music built on discipline and instinct, a precise balance of sharp horn lines, hypnotic bass, and drums that felt like the heartbeat of something ancient. Even after the band dissolved, that sound refused to disappear. By the late 1970 period, young musicians across the United States were digging through crates in search of something pure. What they found were the JB-SE. DJs in New York discovered that their breaks could ignite an entire party. Producers in California realized that sampling the band's rhythms could anchor a song with an energy nothing else could match. Without ever stepping into a hip-hop studio, the JBs became one of the most sampled groups in the world. Tracks like The Grunt, Pass the Peas, and Same Beat turned into cultural touchstones. Drummers studied the swing of Jabo Starks. Bass players tried to imitate the language of Bootsy Collins. Horn sections everywhere used Fred Wesley's arrangements as a blueprint. Their influence reached churches, nightclubs, and classrooms. The JBs had become part of the vocabulary of American music. Their legacy stretched even further when Clyde Stubblefield's legendary break in Funky Drummer became one of the most borrowed rhythms in history. Without the JB, rhythmic innovations, the foundation of 1,980 hip-hop, 1,990 R&B, and even parts of early electronic music might have sounded completely different. Artists from Public Enemy to Dr. Dre, from Prince to Janet Jackson, found themselves building on grooves that originated from that tight, relentless band behind James Brown. But the influence didn't stop with sound. Musicians around the world began to reinterpret what funk meant because of the JBs. In London, young bands treated their records like sacred texts. In Tokyo, collectors searched for rare pressings that had gone unnoticed during their initial release. In Brazil and West Africa, emerging funk movements borrowed the JB's sense of repetition and pulse, blending it into their own cultural rhythms. Their spirit traveled far beyond the borders that once held them. And as the years passed, the music community began reassessing their place in history. Writers who once labeled them James Brown's band now spoke of them as pioneers originators who helped carve the foundation for multiple genres. The JBs weren't just a supporting act anymore. They were a lens through which musicians understood the evolution of groove. More importantly, they represented something deeper, the power of unity. They showed the world what could happen when a group of musicians played with absolute trust in each other, pushing one another toward excellence without ever losing the heartbeat that tied them together. Their legacy wasn't loud or boastful. It didn't rely on headlines or awards. It was carried in the way fans nodded when a certain rhythm kicked in the way DJs still reached for their records, in the way musicians spoke their names with reverence. The JB Blank had become timeless not because the world never forgot them, but because the world kept rediscovering them. As time moved forward, something unexpected began happening in the world of music. The deeper artists, scholars, and fans explored the roots of modern rhythm, the more they found themselves returning to the JBs. It was as if their influence had been hiding in plain sight, woven into the fabric of every beat-driven genre. And slowly, the world began to offer them the recognition that had slipped away during their final years with James Brown. The late 1980 period marked the beginning of this rediscovery. By then, the impact of their recordings had spread far beyond the original releases. The breakbeats, the bass lines, the horn stabs, they were everywhere. Documentary filmmakers sought them out. Record collectors hunted for their early singles. Younger musicians asked questions that older musicians already knew the answers to. If you wanted to understand the evolution of funk, soul, or hip-hop, you had to start with the JBs. This growing awareness led to something even more meaningful: reunions. In 1988, Fred Wesley, Maceo Parker, and Alfred Ellis joined Bobby Bird for a European tour that reignited public interest in the group's legacy. These performances weren't nostalgic acts. They were proof that the musicians who shaped the backbone of funk still carried the fire that once powered the greatest rhythm section in America. Audiences across Europe responded with overwhelming gratitude, many realizing for the first time that these were the architects behind the grooves they had danced to for decades. The following years brought more reunions. Through the 1990 period, the trio toured and recorded as the JB Horns, bringing their signature sound to audiences eager for authenticity in a music world increasingly dominated by digital production. And then, in 2002, something rare happened, a fuller reunion. Bootsy Collins, Bobby Bird, Jabbo Starks, and others came together for the album Bring the Funk On Down, a project that served as both a celebration and a reminder that the JB were never simply a backing band. They were innovators whose work still carried a pulse strong enough to move a new generation. That same year, members of the original rhythm section recorded the soundtrack for the film Super Bad. And for many fans, hearing that unmistakable groove felt like a reunion with an old friend. The music had aged, but it had not faded. If anything, the passage of time made it clearer how far ahead of their era the JBs had always been. As American audiences continued rediscovering them, the global music community followed. Writers published retrospectives. Funk historians re-examined the group's contributions. Younger artists cited them as a primary influence, connecting their work not just to James Brown but directly to the JBs. The idea that they had been forgotten began to fade, replaced by a growing consensus. These musicians were pioneers who deserved their own chapter in the story of modern music. Yet, perhaps the most meaningful recognition came not from scholars or critics, but from everyday listeners. Fans who had danced to their records in the 1970 period shared their memories with their children. Young producers sampled their works and spoke their names with respect. Musicians who had grown up studying their grooves admitted that even after years of playing, they still couldn't fully capture the precision the JBs had mastered so effortlessly. Their legacy, once overshadowed by the towering figure of James Brown, now stood firmly on its own. The world had finally begun to understand what musicians had known all along. The JBs were more than a moment. They were a movement. A movement that shaped genres, inspired generations, and proved that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that never needed the spotlight in the first place. When we look back at the story of the JB, it is impossible not to feel the weight of everything they gave to music. They were never the biggest names on the posters. They were never the faces in the spotlight. Yet somehow, their sound became the heartbeat of an entire era. The grooves they created, the rhythms they shaped, the language they carved out of nothing but instinct and discipline, they still echo through modern music like a memory that refuses to fade. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The snap of the snare, the thump of the bass, the sharp cry of the horns. You can picture those long nights in the studio, the endless tours, the sweat-soaked stages, and the invisible unity that held them together long enough to change the course of American rhythm. They didn't chase fame, they chased the groove. And in doing so, they built a legacy far larger than they ever could have imagined. The world didn't always recognize them. History didn't always give them the credit they deserved. For many years, the JB lived in the shadow of the star they supported. But with time, something beautiful happened. Listeners began to look closer. Musicians began to ask questions. Producers began to trace back the sounds that shaped their youth, only to find that the fingerprints belonged to the JBs. And now, decades later, we understand the truth. They were not forgotten. They were not lost. They were waiting for a generation willing to look deeper, to listen closer, to appreciate the craft behind the legends. Their legacy is not in awards or headlines. It lives in the music that depends on their foundation. It lives in every drum break, every bass line, every horn stab that still makes a crowd move. Maybe that is the real beauty of their story. Greatness does not always stand in front of the camera. Sometimes it stands just outside the light, shaping everything the world sees without ever asking for applause. So now I ask you, do you think the JBs ever received the respect they truly deserved? And what is your favorite moment, memory, or song connected to their legacy? If this story moved you, if you believe that artists like the JBs deserve to be remembered, then take a moment to leave a comment, share your memories, and subscribe to the channel. Because every time we tell their story, every time we speak their name, we keep their light alive. And in the end, that is what matters most. The world may forget, but here we remember.